Well, to be honest with you, I think the we one has to disentangle the different ways in which the situation in Rafah has been and Gaza in a general sense has been depicted in the media because international presses are not one and the same. Unfortunately, most of the driving force behind the way in which the crisis, the catastrophe, the genocide in Gaza has been represented has been a function of national interests and political agendas and diplomatic relations. And so some countries have been able to call a spade in the sense that they've stepped forward, done a significantly remarkable job representing realities on the ground, the collective suffering of Palestinians in Rafah and Gaza, the besieging of an entire population, the humanitarian crisis, the Israeli driven mass starvation of the population, and of course the wanton and very intentional killing of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure. All these things were depicted in a very unadulterated way in a lot of international media, and I would say from across the Muslim world. There are nevertheless exceptions. Some countries who have been very cautious and trepidatious in the way in which they have dealt with this particular crisis. Some of whom are pressured by U.S. U.S. political power, not just in the region but on an international scale, have been very cautious and very much mirroring or imitating or borrowing from some of the Western tropes around this issue. So I would consider those to be quite different and quite distinct. So each country has its own considerations depending on its diplomatic relations, its prospects, and the degree of pressure they've come under from the United States more specifically. As far as the representation of the crisis, one of the main obstacles to actually covering anything that's happening in Gaza is the lack of access to for reporters and journalists from the international media. Because of this incredibly robust and deeply problematic siege, there's been very little access to the territory itself. Very few journalists are on the ground. Very little reporting, and so Israel has kept a really tight noose around, unfortunately, the media representations from Gaza. So it's been the alternative to that has been extremely heavy reliance on either journalists based in Gaza, freelancers, stringers, folks on the ground, citizens who have turned into journalists, anyone trying to depict their lives and their circumstances has become a de facto journalist from Gaza. And of course, Israel has gone to great lengths to annihilate them as well, because in an attempt to eradicate the message of Palestinians in Gaza, they've targeted and killed over 200 journalists or citizen journalists or media personnel and specialists. And so that is, and which of course, according to the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, it makes the genocide in Gaza the deadliest conflict for journalists in recorded history. So that also kind of impacts the way in which stories come out or don't come out from Gaza. Instead, the alternative becomes social media platforms, videos being circulated, sometimes with little verification, but the alternatives have been really dire for most Palestinians trying to get their stories and their messages out of Rafah specifically, and Gaza more generally. That of course paints one picture about global and international coverage. The other is one from the global north and Western countries, where the strong and very deep relations with Israel have painted the picture in a very particular way, a manner that focuses more on Israeli suffering or Jewish suffering at the expense of Palestinians. So, and very, very distinct and clear prohibitions on the type of coverage that's coming out of Gaza, limited expression of empathy for Palestinians and their circumstances, and in some cases a really obvious form of censorship and bias. And there's lots of evidence of that, both from sort of the academic research and media monitoring, all the way to actual media professionals within those Western institutions, European and North American, sharing their circumstances within the newsrooms, describing editorial interference, and things of that sort. So the picture is quite, drastically different between Western news coverage and coverage from most, if not all, of the rest of the world. And then, of course, there's the North American or U.S. more specifically, if we were to think of this as concentric circles within the U.S. The rules and regulations around humanization of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims is shockingly archaic, and so when you look at coverage of the genocide in Gaza in the in the U.S. media, you see a completely different picture. There's only the sort of the victimization and the empathy for Israelis, and Palestine and Palestinians and Gaza and Gazans are nowhere to be found. They're universally perpetrators, and information is not only borrowed but is copied whole cloth directly from the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli media, and their interlocutors who are extremely biased and partial in favor of the Israeli narrative. So that has created almost like sort of a media bubble in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Canada, which has obstructed any real coverage of the catastrophic situation faced by Palestinians in Gaza. And so there are trickles here and there. When the famine, the man-made or human-made famine in Gaza reached its sort of peak a couple of months ago, we started seeing some coverage, but it was largely a function of collective pressure. People online were seeing the footage, were seeing the photos coming out of Gaza, and they were sort of demanding or expecting their news media to be able to respond, at least in covering these stories. And so we began to see some of that trickle in, and of course the repercussions of which were quite substantial. We started seeing sort of celebrities or well-known figures react quite fervently, and I would argue that might have shifted public opinion a little bit in the United States. But by and large, one of the problems that is faced in the United States is the consolidation of media into the hands of very few individuals, very few companies, and those companies are beholden to some of the same sort of editorial perspectives and editorial values that render them consistent with the Israeli kind of way of seeing the world, the Israeli way of representing the conflict. So it's a mixed bag, but unfortunately, there are two bags, and one bag is the Western media, and more extreme of which happens to be the United States, and then the rest of the world, where things are a lot more complicated, and we begin to see more nuance and more accuracy in the reporting of what's happening in Rafah and Gaza. Well, I mean, if we have any faith or any belief or any commitment to international law, then being able to identify and describe a genocide for what it is has major repercussions as far as policy and other legal implications. And so the media and journalism being the first draft of history, if the original and initial archives are ones that represent this as an equal or leveled conflict between two actors or two parties, or that Israel is behaving or operating under and within the rules of international law, or abiding by the Geneva Conventions, sort of rules and regulations around the waging of conflict. All of those things are ways in which one could obfuscate the realities. And so the fourth estate is considered the gravest threat to the Israeli narrative, which is why so much is invented, actually. This is a Freudian slip, but it makes perfect sense. A lot of it has been invented and invested in by the Israeli political establishment to try and promote a specific narrative in the media. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent in the United States by Israeli organizations or pro-Israeli organizations or Zionist aligned lobbying groups to try and promote the Israeli story at the expense of Palestinian lives. And so the repercussions of any slippage can be vast. We begin to see this now with a really dramatic shift in public opinion in the United States, because folks are getting their information from places where traditional media is a lesser or declining player. So cable news or television is not the primary provider of news for persons between the ages of 18 and 25. Most of them are getting their information from online platforms, from influencers, from TikTok, from Instagram, places like that, which is where a lot of the kind of unfettered access and the raw footage is being circulated very widely. And so public opinion is being shaped differently in this moment. But that has meant that there's a greater need on the part of pro-Israeli groups to kind of control those media organizations in some ways, or try to kind of rein in the coverage. So we see kind of the shadow banning of pro-Palestinian influencers or folks who are posting online. We begin to see either the targeting or the firing of reporters in those major news organizations who dare to speak out or who cover the story with any degree of impartiality or representation of Palestinian suffering. We begin to see a real sort of investment in what Israel calls its Hasbara, which is kind of this propaganda machine and a sort of language being generated to kind of debunk or attempt to debunk Palestinian stories and Palestinian narratives. So it's a multifaceted media war, if you will. And that multifaceted media war is designed specifically to ensure that Israel is always and consistently depicted as the not only as the winning party, but the only party worth supporting because of its the morality of its army and its consistent commitment to abiding by international law, all the things that are now very, very clearly sort of as far away from reality as one might imagine. But nevertheless, the implications are quite significant. The implications could be legal in the sense that with the evidence, especially if it's represented in the press and in the media, it can be taken to a court of law, both in domestic or national jurisdictions in the United States or in Canada or in Western Europe, or the slightly more, the outcomes might be far-fetched, but in international law. We've seen both in the in the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice, cases brought against Israel have a sizable amount of evidence coming directly from video and photographic footage that was documented and recorded in Gaza, many of which was relayed to the mainstream and alternative press around the world. And so media coverage is actually evidence, can be used as an evidence of crimes committed in Gaza by the Israeli military. So it's nothing to take lightly. One clear example of of the impact of news coverage is that, for example, shortly after October 7th, with the New York Times and other major publications of note or media of legacy media, I should say, in the United States, covering those attacks, and sometimes in hyperbolic terms. You know, Hamas are described as having done things that are perhaps more excessive than what even the Israeli investigators were able to prove and relay. That was, I mean, for example, I don't know if you remember, like the 40 beheaded babies and those types of things made their way through the North American and Western press quite extensively and helped shape a narrative, and that narrative became an impetus and a justification for Israel's war of so-called self-defense. And so to unravel that or push against it and demonstrate that there is a genocide and Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza requires a lot of really substantial evidence. So sometimes the exaggeration, if it travels very far, is capable of shaping a discourse that becomes quite intractable and difficult to push back against. But all that to say, in the past 2 years, we've begun to see a rather incontestable story around Palestinian suffering, Palestinian victimization, and real evidence of genocide that becomes very, very hard to challenge. So, it's a mixed bag, but my deep worry and deep concern is that the Western media is not learning from these lessons, and the fact that it's quite easy to to buckle in the face of pressure from above, institutional, editorial, state-driven, national interest-driven, or even the use of accusations such as anti-Semitism directed at news media, news personalities who challenge Israel. That it does have a robust impact on how news is crafted or relayed in the United States. But I feel that is also beginning to shift. So, it's we'll see what happens. But I think those are some of the key examples of what can happen to, or what is usually done with, coverage once it's on air. There's only so much that one could handle, kind of regular footage of human suffering. I mean, our capacity to be able to process and ration with and explain and act upon this kind of content is very limiting. But I will say, though, that there's a difference between fatigue and desensitization. We may be fatigued, but our empathy doesn't change or doesn't shift. Desensitization is where we begin to consciously or subconsciously normalize the suffering of Palestinians or suffering of any community. And that's something that I feel Israel has tried to do quite purposefully, which is to say that if the daily sort of news is 150 or 200 or 300 Palestinians killed, before you know it, they become numbers. And in a sense, they are also fundamentally shifting the demographics of Palestine, reducing the population of Palestinians, men, women, and children. And that is, deeply criminal and quite devastating to even think about. Having said that, I would argue that the real sort of desensitization is not coming as a result of the media. It's coming from a place where publics around the world are increasingly disenchanted with the instruments that they have access to and their inability to change the reality on the ground. So, for example, here in Canada where I live, we've had about 2 years worth of really substantial mobilization and protests in every aspect and facet of life, with so many people involved in them. And yet, despite that, they feel that they've not been able to push for divestment from Israel or an arms embargo. They haven't been able to stop the mass killing of Palestinians. They haven't been able to really substantially impact realities on the ground. And I think that is the part that's much more disheartening, is that it seems as though there's nothing that could be done to change this without a real sort of commitment on the part of the United States government, which is the main benefactor and supporter and funder of Israel in this war. That all other players, in a sense, don't matter or matter less, and that I think is the real tragedy. But I feel as though people's commitment to Palestinian freedom, Palestinian justice, and Palestinian liberation remains very much alive and well. And even if the content continues to look this way, it is consecrating long-term commitments to the Palestinian cause. A clear example of that has been the fact that several Western countries have, in 2 years, shifted their position almost entirely on recognition of Palestinian sovereignty and recognizing Palestinian statehood, including Canada, France, and Australia. And so that is not something to take lightly. In those countries 2 years ago, you couldn't say the word Palestine without being sort of called out or accused of either anti-Semitism or the desire to eliminate Israel or some other sort of outlandish idea. So that is a function of sustained coverage, sustained access, and sustained mobilization on the part of pro-Palestine groups here in the West. So I would say that if the question is between whether to cover what's happening in Gaza or not, the answer should always be in favor of coverage. So long as Palestinians are subjected to this level of dehumanization, we are required, requested, and demanded of, as reporters, as journalists, and as members of the concerned public around the world, to constantly tell their story. And the impact is not something to take lightly. And then finally, I'll say that the repercussions of sustained coverage can go beyond just the feverish pursuit of clicks and likes and shares and popularity and trending, and rather can have substantial implications for the future, where the next generation of leaders in the world will know exactly what happened in Gaza between 2023 and 2026. And that can help kind of consecrate new political realities. It's the same thing that happened with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where, many of us have forgotten, but Mandela was incarcerated for almost 27 years. So in those 27 years, it was sustained coverage of the apartheid regime that made it impossible for it to continue eventually. So coverage, there are ebbs and flows, but the fundamental reality here is that without sustained coverage, we can't expect change.